Hey everyone, I'm posting the second conversation that Michael Levin and I had. Sorry it took a little bit of time to do so. I'm sure you're all busy too with work and end of the year. And I just wanted to wait until I could really listen back to it while I was working on a relative paper. And I did just listen back to it. We had this conversation quite a few months ago. So it's wonderful to listen to it again and rediscover some really important points that I hadn't remembered from it. We really get into the idea of the binary and the continuum, and we talk about waymaking and cognition as navigation and try to kind of get into a little of that nuance. So I'll just go ahead and post it and leave it as it is for the most part. And the next one will come in the next year. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments, and I hope you have a wonderful end of the year and a wonderful 2024. I remember that we were talking, just had mentioned the Xenobots. Should we just start there? Or
Sure.
Yeah. What I remember that I wanted to ask you about was when I think what I'm interested in is, do the Xenobots create their own shape, or do you choose the shape? Do you roll them up, or do they roll themselves?
So there's two types of Xenobots, and what you can do is you take off the ectodermal cells off the embryo, and then you can dissociate them. Yeah, so you separate them. They're kind of like just floating there, and then you put them in the little pit, and they kind of coalesce together. So there's two versions of that. By default, if you do nothing other than that, they will arrange into a Xenobot on their own. You do not have to roll them up.
So they roll themselves.
They do it themselves. But now what they will do is they will make a spherical bot. If you want to manipulate that, there are two basic paths that you can go. One which we've already published, and the other one is what we're working on. The thing that we've published is that you can sculpt them. So this is what I would call a bottom-up intervention, because you're trying to micromanage it. So what you do is, and this is my staff scientist in my center, I did this, Doug Blackiston, and so he's a microsurgeon. What he'll do is he'll go in and basically sculpt out, ablate certain parts of it, and at that time you can also put in other kinds of cells if you want. So the very first paper actually he sculpted it to have little stubby little legs, like a little ottoman kind of thing. And then he put some muscle cells in there, and the muscle cells could make the legs go, and this thing actually walked. That's not the Xenobot that I spend most of my time talking about, but that was actually the first paper. So you can sculpt it, and he sculpted it that way. He also in the last paper, what he did was he made it like a little Pac-Man with a little triangle taken out of it. And what we found is that shape is really good at gathering up a bunch of loose cells and packing them into the next generation of Xenobot. And that shape was actually designed by an AI. That was designed by an artificial intelligence algorithm running in Josh Bongard's group. So you can do stuff like that. Now, what we want to do in the future is we want to get beyond that, and we want to be able to communicate morphological goals to those cells. And we want to say, I need you to be flat like a pancake, or I want you to be like a football, or have this more complex shape, like whatever it's going to be. So ultimately down the road, that's what we want. But we haven't done that yet. We haven't published that yet. So we're working on that.
I think shape is so important, right? In the morphology, and I'm trying to kind of connect it to all these other bigger ideas that I'm working on in terms of cognition. And you already sort of do it in your work, but I'm trying to find the link. So
yeah,
I guess what I was asking is I'm wondering, I guess first I would ask you, where's the chemistry and where's the mind and the way that the Xenobot forms itself in your kind of opinion? But behind that is what I'm trying to get at is, are they kind of working on the patterns of their own shape? Is there a continuity between the shape that they are and the shapes that they create, in a sense?
Yeah. Well, I want to say one thing first, which is that the question of that continuum of shape and mind and everything else, Xenobots are not yet a great example for that, because there's so little we know. So I'm of the firm. I mean, many people have opinions as to what the cognitive level of Xenobots has to be, but just because they have sort of philosophical commitments to specific viewpoints. I don't believe that is the way to do this. I think it's an empirical question. I think we have to do experiments, and so I have not yet made any claims about the cognition of the Xenobots, because we haven't actually published the data showing what it is that they can do. right? We have
Yeah.
a few things, but we have not. So I haven't made any claims about Xenobots
No,
about
of
that
course not.
one
I'm
way or the
jumping
other.
ahead. I'm jumping
Yeah,
ahead
yeah, no,
because
no.
the way I
I mean,
define cognition is already movement, and it's completely different than, I'm already starting at a different place, so
yeah,
that's why
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
asking. But you're right.
yeah.
That's good to point that out.
Well, only because, right? Because ultimately we want to be able to be very specific, and we want to be able to say Xenobots have this level of competency in navigating space. They can, what can they do? Maybe they. So we're testing. Do they have preferences about where they go? Do they have memories about where they've been? Do they have ability to overcome obstacles? Do they have the ability to work together? You test all these things, right? So we don't know, and so right. So that's why I'm not making a claim, but if we sort of step back to this more general notion of waymaking or navigation or whatever it's going to be, then absolutely they're not only doing that in three-dimensional space, they're doing that in morphospace. I mean, they do, and in fact, if you cut them and injure them, they will in fact try to regenerate back to their original shape. So there is some of that there. It's just there are other systems where we know more, and thus it's easier to kind of make that connection in a rigorous way. Otherwise you're fighting two battles at once, right? You're fighting this general tendency of people to try to separate cognition from morphogenesis, and also you're fighting the fact that we actually don't know enough about what they specifically can do. So that's the problem. So I try to kind of separate those.
Yeah, this gets really messy, but I think maybe it's okay to just like let it be messy for a second, because
yeah.
if we could, we can of course erase this. Usually when we hear cognition as humans, we think of mind and thought and memory and all this kind of awareness of cognition, really, right?
Yeah.
But if we could kind of erase that in a way that I think both of us are kind of trying to get at this different understanding of cognition that I think is actually very similar, which is why I'm so excited about your work. And actually, I think your work is kind of maybe an example of what I've been trying to formulate, I guess. And I think there's other examples in different areas of science. Like, we're all sort of trying to talk about this, but if we could just like start over for a second and just say, okay, any making way, or I also use the term navigation, but just as we know, that always means you have a goal. And sometimes maybe making way doesn't have a specific goal, which is something else I want to talk to you about. But if we just think of it as any agent from any position making its way through its encounter, or I think what you might call like a surface, computational surface. I started to realize that your light cone idea is a little bit like what I mean by an encounter, right? So if we just determine a position, an agent, what I say an agent base, and I've heard you call agental, I think we also use similar terminology. If we just say, okay, this is from where we're going to measure it, and however that position makes its way is cognition. Like if we just pretend like that's what cognition is, has nothing to do with that creature, that agent knowing that it's cognitive or anything else.
Yeah.
Then when you create this kind of or you don't even create, when you've changed the frog, let's just go with the frog, when you've taken the skin and you've separated the cells and they start to reform, that is a kind of making way. So for me, that is already a cognitive act, and it's also physics, like, and it's not either or of those things, it's both of those things, but we would call them differently depending on from where we're going to measure it. So if you take it like that, would you just say, okay, then it is a cognitive thing, that the way it comes together and forms this new shape and then begins forming other shapes that look like it and so on?
So yeah, yes, but to me, because I treat cognition as a continuum, not a binary variable, I think the real question is going to be where on that continuum is it? So what is it capable of? So I completely agree that this like metacognition, that I know I'm aware and I know my goals and I can change my goals and stuff. Yeah, that's all really advanced kind of stuff that's way on the right of this continuum. Things are on the continuum long before they get to that point. So I have no trouble saying that very simple systems, even bacteria have some primitive metacognitive loops about their metabolism and things like that. So so I have no problem saying that we are somewhere on the much lower sort of part of that spectrum, but we're somewhere on there. I'm sure we are. I just don't know exactly where. There are other systems where I can tell you where I think they are because the experiments have been done. That's why the only reason I harp on this point, and I'm not trying to get too specific. I'm fine with letting things be messy and percolate while
no, it's
we sort of
important to
figure it
find
out.
clarity.
I'm completely fine with that. But I'm trying to fight this pervasive tendency for people to make claims about these things,
Mm-hmm.
just based on their philosophical pre-commitments, not on actual data. And so I keep, for that reason, I keep saying, as much as I like all kinds of things to be cognitive, I don't know where they are on a continuum until we test them. So we don't know, how much can they do associative conditioning? I don't know. Can they, right? Can they,
Mm-hmm.
when we have evidence that they can form memories now, but we don't know how complex these memories can be. Can they chain them together? I have no idea. These are all things that we need to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And the other interesting thing is, I didn't realize how. So it's funny. You said a minute ago that navigation presupposes a goal, and I never really thought about that. I realize now that people do think of it that way. I didn't realize
I
it.
didn't either. I don't think it does, but it does in the
I
literature
don't
of
think it. Yeah,
neuroscience.
it's so strange.
Mm-hmm.
We even had a paper where we talk about one of these synthetic things traversing a landscape.
Mm.
And traversing, to me, just it could be a random walk. It just means that it's moving over the landscape, right? But a reviewer got back and said, "Oh, traversing must mean it's this like this very directed kind." I did not realize that people have those
Mm-hmm.
connotations. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think for navigation, you could have a very generic goal of exploring a landscape. It doesn't mean you have the goal of knowing where you're going. I don't think that implies at all. So I don't know. Here, this is one of those things where I think we have to decide: are we going to use words in the way that everybody uses them because we want to avoid those battles and have have more adoption, or do we bite the bullet and say, no, actually, here's what those words should mean otherwise, right? And just sort of lead the hopefully a change in the terminology. So sometimes both are useful, right? So I don't know. Certain things I try to insist on, and then other things like whatever.
Yeah, there's a big debate you probably know in neuroscience now about language and the terms we use, and Buzaki, who um, advised me a little bit on some of my own stuff, talks a lot about how we just sort of inherited all these terms, like memory, for example, from James, and we sort of assume what it is before we even look for it, in a sense. So I think that's what I mean by the messiness, is like we're all assuming terms mean a certain thing based on our past trajectory. And we don't realize, I mean, you write about this a bit in that paper you sent me last time. Some of the confusion is just that we don't have a kind of an understanding of what we're talking about. There's a lot of misinterpretation going on that we don't even really know about. I think that's what I'm actually trying to do in formulating a philosophy or a theory of cognition, which is really all I'm doing is gathering all this other data and research from science and trying to show
Yeah.
that, actually we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's all I'm really trying to do. It's not even that
Yeah.
there's some new thing. It's just to try to put it into a framework that actually works across species and scales and disciplines, because nobody's done that because it's so
Yeah.
messy. But maybe we can talk about a more kind of concrete example before I start asking other questions, because the Xenobots, I know it's still very new, and also a lot of people in a similar way are coming with different references of what they think you're doing.
Yeah.
So it can get very difficult. So what's an example that you think where we could actually talk more about physics, mind, kind of software, hardware?
Yeah, I mean, for example, we could talk about planaria fragments figuring out how many heads they're supposed to form, or we could talk about tadpoles rearranging their face from abnormal positions to become frogs. Some of these examples where we can talk about the newt kidney tubule, where it solves a really amazing kind of defect in its own parts to still get to where it's going, which is to make a proper newt with a proper kidney tubule and so on. So yeah, any
Okay,
of those
let's talk about
examples.
Planarian, because they seem
Yeah.
to be the answer to everything in a way. So if we think about them, which regenerate in a completely different way, or would you say regenerate or reproduce in a very different
Yeah,
way than
they regenerate. Yeah.
humans? Okay. So I've heard you say something like that. I think in talking about those, that bioelectricity is this kind of strange boundary or layer between the mind and the physics when it comes to changing. And this is something I'm still not so clear about, is what the electricity is and the bioelectricity, and how we're kind of distinguishing between matter and that pattern. So I don't know, maybe, and that's kind of a very broad, but in terms of those, where would you start to think about software and hardware,
Yeah.
or mind and
I
chemistry?
Yeah, I start to think of it actually. Let me try a slightly different way that I don't think I've talked about it this way in these the talks yet. Uh, think about a computer, right? When you first turn on the juice, for some number of, I don't know, probably nanoseconds, what you're dealing with is a piece of physics, a dynamical system well described by Maxwell's equations and all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, once it starts grabbing, once it starts executing the thing that we recognize as formal computation in the von Neumann architecture, so it starts grabbing instructions off of this memory location and doing something with them. It's still a physical machine. It's still obeying the laws of physics. It's still doing all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we can look at it and say, wow, it's executing logic, the sort of basic principle of rational thought. It's doing, let's say it's calculating the and function or the or function or something like that, or it's some kind of calculation. So so here you have a system. You can look at it a certain way and say, you can be a reductionist and say, none of that exists. All I see is electrons moving according to Maxwell's equation. That's all that exists. Or you could say, I mean, yeah, that's true, but that's the most boring part of this. The more interesting part of this, and the more useful part of this, is that it's computing functions. It's calculating. Maybe it's reasoning. It's inference. It's calculating inferences and so on. So I think that is like a minimal simplistic. Before we get into life and all that, that's a kind of a simplistic system where you start to see that it's both. It's, yes, it is a physical system. Yes, it obeys the laws, but also it's doing this amazing thing that's getting close to cognition. Like, it's actually generating, it's following truth tables and those kinds of things. So I think the same thing happens in living organisms. You can look at the bioelectricity as just the flow of ions in and out of membranes and what that does to the arresting potential and all of that. But fundamentally, much like with the computer, it's computation, because there's an interpreter. There's somebody that looks at that whole physics and acts on it based on what they see. And in the case of the computer, it's us. In the case of the biology, it's cells and tissues watching each other and making decisions based on what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And the first part of what you said, my point about changing scales, it's like sometimes I'll start a talk by saying, did you know that I can control 30%? I can depolarize 30% of my body cells just by thinking about it, by force of thought alone. And people say, well, that's crazy. And then a couple of people say, well, maybe it's some sort of weird, yoga thing or something, right? Some kind of mind body medicine. Like, no, this is 24/7. This is what happens in your body when you decide to get up out of bed in the morning and go to work.
Mm-hmm.
That's because you have a high level cognitive, in fact, a metacognitive system that has social goals and whatever, and decides that you're going to work. And in order for that to happen, the muscles in your body have to become depolarized in a certain pattern so you can walk out.
Yeah.
And that means that our architecture is such that the thing we call cognition, which are these high level kind of mental processes and goals, has to filter down to the molecular biology of your cells. It has to, otherwise there would be no voluntary motion.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and so you say, well, how in the heck does that happen? Well, bioelectricity. So neural and non-neural, that's why I think bioelectricity is so exciting, because it shows us that it is the layer that enables cognitive processes to control chemistry in your cells.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what happens all the time. It's not some rare, specialized thing.
And at the same time, it is chemistry itself in a way, right? I mean,
Yeah,
doesn't it depend on where we're going to measure or look at it, what we're going to call it?
Absolutely. You can choose as an observer, and observers are scientists, observers are parasites, observers are conspecifics, observers are all kinds of things. You are your own observer yourself too.
Yeah.
As an observer, you can choose the level that you work on.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be clear that not all choices are equal. So if you are, just imagine, I kind of imagine it this way. You are running a software company, and you're interviewing candidates, and somebody shows up and to the interview, and they say, hey, I'm a strong reductionist. I believe in electrons, and I believe in Maxwell's equations, and that is it. There is nothing else going on in the computer. It's not that they're wrong exactly. Would you hire that person? They're not going to code a damn thing, because
there's
they fundamentally,
there's no dynamic way of change there.
Well, they don't believe that the algorithm makes the electrons dance. If you do not believe that this algorithm, what's an algorithm? It's not a physical thing. But if you don't believe that the algorithm functionally makes the computer do things, you will never write any code ever. And that's it. And it's not that you're wrong and you can have a great life in physics, but you're not going to invent software. So that's what, that's my point. And I think evolution's very quote unquote aware of this, in the sense that these observers do not, for example, when cells watch each other's voltage, and they make decisions based on each other's voltage, they are not watching whether that voltage got there by sodium, by potassium, by chloride. They're ignoring those details. They're watching the voltage. Why
it's
is
interesting
it
you say watch, by the way, because
they're
that makes it
measuring
sound like they're looking at it or something, but it could be
They're
just sensing it too, right? Aren't they? I mean, it's not like with eyes necessarily.
No, there's no eyes. I'm saying, I don't mean eyes. I mean, they're sensing it. They're taking measurement. They're taking
it's a sensory measurement. Assessment.
It's a sensory measurement. That's what I mean. They're paying attention to the voltage. And in doing so, they specifically ignore the molecular details of, well, was it sodium or potassium that got you to that voltage? They ignore that, the same way that when you're a good coder at a particular level, you have to ignore the levels underneath. If you always jump down to the lower level, you're very limited in what you can do.
That's what language is giving you in a way. I mean, that's why we create those kind of scaffolding systems in a way. But so does that, I think, just to go back to this idea of navigation, right? And the way it's used in the literature is that there's a goal. And so that it's as if the agent itself knows that it has a goal, or the agent has the goal. But if we think of it in the way you just described, that kind of stuff, it could also be that the person measuring it has seen what its goal is or something. I mean, you could also kind of,
100%. That's the definition in my TAME paper. I say that goals are in the eye of the beholder. Now you are also a beholder of your own goals. So it's not just, I'm not saying that we are nothing except what people make of us. I'm not saying that, but any of this, when we say a system has a particular goal, that means that I, as an observer, have picked a problem space. I picked a bunch of states that I think this thing has as goals. And I've done some experiments to see that if I perturb it, it still tries to get those goals met. It's mostly, it is, and somebody else could have a completely different, a set of choices about that. And in principle, multiple viewpoints could be right, but they're not all equivalent, because some give you much better outcomes than others.
Right.
So
that's kind of
very much so. I think it's very observer, it's observer dependent.
That's what ends up causing the trouble in a way sometimes, is that we're still stuck in that either or dichotomous model where we think it's either software or hardware, it's either mind or physics, always across all positions of assessment. When it's because it's very hard to hold in your mind the fact that depending on from what agent you're measuring or assessing, what is physics at one level can look like mind at the next, or be mind. I mean, because that's a really I think that's a very hard thing to articulate or to step back enough to see.
Well, another way to put it is this. I think the reason physicists see chemicals and particles and so on and not mind, they see matter and not mind, is because they're using low agency tools. So you need some sort of an impedance match between the tools you're using and what you hope to see. So if you're using rulers and voltmeters and all of these kinds of things, like as physicists do, those are all low agency systems. All you're ever going to see is low agency matter. You're only ever going to see that. If you want to see mind, if you want to see mind, you have to have a mind to be able to recognize mind.
But even then, it sounds like we're still talking about mind as if it's something else. So in a way, it's like you have to have a mind that has similar regularities to whatever it is you're measuring. I mean,
well, that's a good question, right? I mean, this has been dealt with in science fiction for 100 years or more. It's like, are we going to be able to recognize minds that are very different from ours? And I think it'll be hard for sure, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think you get there by stretching your own mind. And I think this is what the field of diverse intelligence is all about. It's about stretching your own mind in new directions to be able to recognize a wider set of beings.
Let me push you on that a little, because if we think of mind as the way we make way, and basically this gets to memory and everything, because it's not just that you're making way. It's that you're aligning with certain regularities, which then you kind of habitually use in the same way you were talking about coding, right? You can't keep recoding everything every time. I mean, so you're sort of building this framework by which you can move better and farther and explore more. So if we really think of mind as that, then more or less what we're saying is we just don't recognize certain forms of making way or movement. For example, if something's using some kind of electrical physics to move that we haven't been able to observe and clarify yet from our sensory position, we wouldn't see it. I mean, it happens already all the time, right? With different kinds of animals and things.
Yeah. I 100%. And I think if I remember correctly, and I'm not sure that I do, but if I remember correctly, I think that at some point maybe it was the ancient Egyptians or somebody thought that the brain was a way to cool the blood because and I mean, yeah, from a certain perspective, that's great. It's a big radiator fin and it cools the blood. Yeah. But you've missed the important. And I think this happens to us all the time. I think we look at stuff. In science, this happens all the time. You look at stuff and you have a level of explanation, and you say, great, now I understand what it does. And what really harms the ability to discover these things is this kind of this idea that you're always supposed to skew downwards. That the lowest level explanation is always preferred. That if you can do it in terms of chemistry instead of cognition, you're better off. That I think is absolutely pernicious, and it keeps us from discovering these other very useful perspectives.
Absolutely, because that itself is one. It's like a linear instead of a spectrum. I think a spectrum can be understood as linear, but that's not. I don't think that's what you're saying. This continuity. When you talk about scale-free cognition or something, you're not necessarily talking about it's linear with a beginning and end or something. But
no.
When we talk about reduction, that's what we're kind of talking about. That everything can be reduced in the same way, rather than there's all these kind of fractal positions from which everything can be decomposed, or the same thing can be decomposed in many different ways, right? Depending on where you're going to measure from.
Yeah. Well, and also it's a very specific, actually, and very strong claim, and it's not often made explicit. But I think most scientists work as though they believe this, which is that they say you really should reduce it to, let's say, chemistry. But they don't really mean the full reductionist program, because if somebody then said, oh, you mean like quantum foam, like we'll reduce it, they say, not quantum foam, that's too far. Chemistry, it's all chemistry. I'm like, well, then you're not a real reductionist, are you? That just means you've picked chemistry as your preferred level, but the stuff underneath. And if you want to, I don't know what if it's in favor now or what, but if you want a string theory explanation of genes, they're going to say, you're crazy. It's too far down. Chemistry is the way to go. And I'm just saying that's not good reductionism. That just means you've picked chemistry. And that's a very strong, and that's a very strong claim that chemistry is the level for all of these things. And I don't think it's remotely true, but I think we need to understand that that's a commitment that a lot of people have.
Yeah, and I think that's important too. That because it can quickly sound as if I am trying to reject these binaries, but actually these binaries, chemistry or mind, for example, or we could take other things, they're very important. That they actually help us to understand the system, and they are literal, and they are meaningful in all of this. It's just that, for me at least, it's like, how do we understand that those are just those are not just, those are ways we've developed to understand something that can be understood from other positions through other categories without one or the other being false or true specifically.
Yeah, I think I'm even more radical on this point. I think I don't like the binaries because they lead to pseudo problems, right? Once if you like binaries, then what do you make of embryonic development? Because you start as just physics, as a little quiescent oocyte, an unfertilized egg. And then before you know it, you're 9 months later, you've got these cognitive capacities and you're recognizing shit. So if it's binary, then you owe a story about where it clicks over.
See,
and there is no place.
I don't think it is binary, but I think it can help us understand. Like, for example, how would we now? For me, I would say, from the beginning, that's making way. From the beginning, that's cognitive. This is very hard because I also mean from the beginning. Like, I mean cognition is making way. I also mean making way is cognition. So I'm not reducing walking or swimming or crawling to cognition. And I'm not reducing cognition to walking and swimming and crawling. I'm saying those are two different ways which we can measure a process that is not binary. So in that way, the binary becomes important just because of contrast and the role that contrast plays and how so far we've proceeded to develop a kind of knowledge. Because I don't know, maybe you disagree, but in a way, I feel like now we can see that process of that 9 months as cognitive and as making way or navigating.
Yeah.
And those things aren't opposite, but somehow we use this binary categorization to develop this science that allowed us to take that step back now and go, oh, actually, this process is not binary.
Yeah. So I agree with you. I think it's cognitive from the very beginning, but that has an interesting implication because the very beginning is a little blob of that's well described by chemistry. So once you say that's cognitive, then then people say, well, then what isn't? I mean, basically, then chemical reactions. And I say, yeah, look at the minimal matter research in diverse intelligence. You know, active matter droplets. I mean, yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
so then that basically pushes you to this idea that there may not be anything that isn't described by some metaphor from behavioral science somewhere, and that may
Mm-hmm.
well be true. And people like Chris Fields and Carl Fiston, who are working out a kind of Carl calls it a physics of sentience and the sentience of physics. It's
Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
redoing the fundamental way we look at physics from an active inference perspective. Yeah, that's great, and I think in many ways that undoes the binary distinction that people like to make. But I also think, I think these, like, if we step back and we say, okay, what are these words for? What are these categories even for? Right? Why are people
Exactly.
using? I think what it all boils down to is it's a protocol claim. It's a claim about if you tell me this is a system that is here on this continuum. It's a mechanical clock, or it's a learning agent, or it's a thermostat, or whatever. All you're really saying is I don't need to know if you think it's mind or matter or whatever. What you're really telling me is here is a collection of tools that you should use to interact with the system. And those tools might be rewiring, they might be rewards and punishments, they might be a complex a conversation that we're going to have, they might be just resetting a set point. That's what I hear when I hear somebody claim that this system is it or isn't that. What I want to know is, great, what are the set of tools? You're telling me that rewards and punishments won't work, that I have to use rewiring? Well, let's find out. You could be right, you could be wrong. That's why I think it's an empirical matter, because these are all protocol claims in the end.
Mm-hmm. And I think
What
that,
techniques are you going to use?
yeah, and that's why grounding it in engineering, like
Mhm.
looking at it from that framework, can be the most helpful instead of from a more theoretical sort of standpoint. And also, I mean, it can get if we would just say, oh, everything is cognitive and everything is way making. That's really not true. You can't actually say that because you're always speaking from a position of measurement or assessment. So, I mean, that would be like a whole discussion within itself about how we have to sort of apply the same idea to our own
Yeah,
our own
yeah,
position. It
yeah,
becomes very
yeah,
meta in that way, and
yeah,
really you're just trying to understand something. And when I start to think about why are we doing this, right? Like, or when people start saying, "Oh, does that mean that life is whatever moves? If it doesn't make its way, then it's not life." Okay, yeah, maybe, but that life itself is an assessment from our position. So yeah, but I think it's great that you said, like, what's the point? Because we could just maybe right now even go to a really practical level. Like, in our practical position as agents in this existence that we're in, there are particular challenges and difficulties and urgencies. Whether you want to look at it on a planetary scale or you want to look at it in terms of your own psychology and how to get through the day, for people who have certain uh, challenges, like physical challenges or mental challenges, however you want to assess that and name it. We want to do something about that, right? We might not need to understand why so much as just alleviation or better way making or better navigation, right? Which I think you're by focusing on engineering, are you sort of framing it towards that too a bit when it comes to your own work?
yeah. And I mean, I see engineering really broadly. So one way to I don't just mean engineering because we're going to treat humans and have human relationships the way we engineer Roombas and things like that. Engineering to me is much broader. So I think of it as more of the way that you can think about hacking. So hacking. So if you're a hacker, you might be on one level where you're down rewiring some wires. You might be writing code and things like that, or you might be doing the social engineering part where you're relating to other people and getting them to tell you their passwords or whatever, whatever it's going to be. It's all, you're comfortable at different places along that continuum. And I think that, yes, on the left side of that continuum, it's all engineering because you are mostly exerting your own agency to get the thing to do whatever you want it to do. But on the higher level of that continuum, when you're interacting with animals, with other humans, with other high level minds, or whatever they may be, however they may be embodied, it's much more of a dance where their agency is giving you something. It's not just a one way kind of a thing. But that's that's continuous. People like to have pet lizards and things like this. It's not just my vacuum cleaner versus my spouse. I mean,
Right.
there's all kinds of stuff in between, right? Where you can have different degrees of relationships depending on the match or the mismatch between your cognitive icons. And so engineering is all the way from like very, very mechanical kinds of stuff, all the way up to complex human relationships where there's multiple loci of agency involved. And it's not just about control, it's about getting something back because the other side is also agential like you.
Yeah, that's a great point. To go back to the Planarian from that position. So this is something I don't understand totally. When you change or some other whatever, anything that you've talked about in your work, when you're going to, for example, change the position of the eye, or you're going to grow something in a different way, or and you're basically, that's bioelectric, right? You're changing the pattern. You're not changing the genes. It's not happening in transcriptional space. It's happening in
Correct.
this. So what's happening
Well,
there? Is it that you're changing the communication between the ions? I mean, are you changing the sodium? What's actually happening there on that level that's changing that?
Yeah. So physically, the way you do it is by there are 4 or 5 different techniques by which you can change the pattern of voltage around across a set of tissues. You can use ion channel modulation. You can use optogenetics. You can change sodium, potassium chloride. None of the details matter for the reason that I said before. As long as you get the voltage right, I mean, the details matter when you're trying to get the voltage right, but there are many ways of doing it. And it doesn't matter how you got there. What makes the change is the change in voltage. Voltage is super cool because it's a high level entity. Voltage doesn't know if it got there by sodium or by voltage. It's like this coarse grained feature. And that is what the cells are tracking. They're not tracking the individual ions, they're tracking the voltage. So, so you make that change. The reason you make that change is because that electrical pattern is literally a memory in the mind of the collective intelligence of cells. That group of cells is storing a memory of what does a correct Planarian look like? And that information, they have to have that information because when they're damaged, they have to rebuild a correct Planarian.
So it's kind of the trajectory or all the nested coding. You're shifting that, but you're shifting it all at once.
We're shifting the set point. So when you have a thermostat, right, in your house, you may not know how anything works. You don't need to. You don't need to rewire it. You may have no idea what the details are. But if you know, you have to know a couple of things. You have to know it's a thermostat. If you miss that part, then no good. So you have to know that that's what it is. And once you've guessed that that's what it is, you have to know how to reset the set point. And we know that for a thermostat, there's a particular register in memory that has a number in it. That number is what the whole system is going to use as its representation of what is good and versus bad. It sets the baseline valence for that system. So if it's good, then nothing happens. If it's bad, then it's got to exert all kinds of energy to try to get to wherever life is good. So
it's very specific to that agent base, that position, that. Yeah,
it is. Although although people have done experiments in memory transfer, and there is some ability to take that medium and stick it into a different agent and have them interpret it the right way. That's a very big open area of research for the future. Like how much of that. My favorite example of that is caterpillar butterfly. So if you train caterpillars to look for the leaves that they eat on a disc of a particular color. They become a butterfly. The body is completely changed. The brain is completely refactored. Cells, so most of the
Like
cells are
melted
killed.
in.
You're right. The whole thing. And then the butterfly, not only does the butterfly remember the original information, but it's actually generalized because the caterpillar said leaves are to be found on this particular thing. Butterfly doesn't eat leaves. Butterfly doesn't want leaves. It wants nectar. But what a butterfly remembers is food. It generalizes the notion of food from leaves and nectar, right? And
Mm.
so amazing. But it's a completely different body that's interpreting that memory. So not
Mm.
only does it have the memory, not only can it still interpret that memory, but it can also generalize from that.
Mm.
So to some extent, it seems very specific to the agent, but on the other hand, we have these examples of these memories sort of porting across agents, which I think there's something here that will be huge. I think we just don't
Yeah, I
understand
love that
well.
example of the caterpillar and butterfly, but I also think it's kind of tricky. I mean, I think I was listening to one of your talks, I was thinking, if we could zoom into that process of whatever is happening when the caterpillar is changing to the butterfly, of course, there's going to be continuity, isn't there? Like, from my perspective, if I'm thinking of it as a trajectory, right? If you're kind of mapping a trajectory, so you're going to just start with any particular agent base within that whole thing. It's not that everything becomes mush and then reforms. I mean, you could sort of, if you could zoom, could you kind of follow one position as a trajectory that's then changing in? And because I guess that's what I was getting at too with the Xenobot, like, does it create its own shape, or is the shape created from where it's coming from? Is there some kind of continuity between not necessarily the physical shape, but, the same way you talk about all these other different spaces, and I do too. I think this is a big part of this new understanding of cognition, is all these different spaces from which we can, again, measure or assess. Like, wouldn't there be some space in which that is a continuous trajectory between caterpillar and butterfly?
Well, there may be, but I mean, look, we don't. For example, if it were that simple, we would have computers that were robust to that. We don't. If you take a computer, a normal computer architecture, and you swap some memory cells around, nothing works.
Mhm.
There's physical continuity, but the thing is completely gonna not work.
Yeah, but that
If
could just be that we haven't, I mean, in the same way that we can't zoom in to the degree that I'm talking about, then we also wouldn't be able to represent it in a computer. I mean,
Well, except that in the computer we can zoom into to all the way. In the computer, there's nothing preventing. That's why I choose the computer, because unlike biology, where things are hard, in the computer we build it from copper atoms. Like, we know exactly
yeah, but
what's.
that's only one kind of particular uh, representation or something that we've actually created. Um, I think I like that you say it as a companion or a partner, right? In this kind of journey. So there could be, I mean, we could think of quantum computers, or we could think of some kind of living computer built from bacteria and fungi or something that might actually, then you probably could switch around a couple things if it's a
Yeah,
living,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know.
For sure. No, I'm not saying it's impossible to do that. I'm saying it's entirely possible. I'm just saying
We haven't done it.
we have no idea how that would work, because we do not have any architectures that have that property. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the butterfly does, so we know it's possible. Somehow it gets done. Um, but also the question of what is their continuity of, because some kind of an engram that said leaves uh, is not what the butterfly is picking up,
No,
right?
no.
So
That's what I mean by
s-
a different space. It's not the space that we
uh,
assume. Yeah, it would
yeah,
have to
we
be
don't
some
know.
other
Yeah.
way of looking at it. Yeah.
There's also this issue of, and I think this is probably what we're getting at when you were talking about, what are the Xenobots really doing? Like, one of the things, when we ask where do biological shapes come from, the typical answer is, well, selection. You look like a
Mhm.
frog because over the years, everything that didn't look like a frog and tried to live in this pond died out. So now
Mm,
you look like a frog. Okay, that's fine, except that there's never been any Xenobots, and there's never been selection to be a good Xenobot.
exactly.
And so it isn't that. Which is one of the reasons we made Xenobots, is exactly to probe exactly this issue. Where do these patterns come from?
Mhm.
And I think we have to be really, we have to redefine what we're asking, because this is my kind of favorite stupid example that I always give. You ever seen a Galton board? You know what that is?
Mhm.
They have this, right? So you get a toy of this on Amazon. It's like it's a board. It's got a bunch of nails banged into it. You take a bucket of marbles and you sort of dump it on top, and the marbles go boom, 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 boom. And if you got enough marbles, the outcome is always the same. It's a bell curve. Makes this beautiful, binomial distribution, right? And so you can ask the question, all right, that's a great curve. Where is that pattern encoded? So you start staring at the nails. Well, I don't see it there. And you start looking at the wood. Well, I don't see it there. And is it the distribution of nails? Not really. Is it how I dump the marbles in? No. Where does it come from? And so I think, and there are many other examples like this. I think we have to. Basically, this is what Plato and Pythagoras were on about when they were talking about this Platonic space of form. That there are laws of physics, laws of computation, and so on, that are not to be found in the physical world. The details of all the physics could be different at the Big Bang. All the laws of the physics could be different. The distribution of prime numbers is still what it is. It's not going to change. So a lot of the answer to the question of where do these shapes come from, that you have to look there in addition to, it's because, in the physical world, somebody scribbled on this particular scratch pad, before. It's partially that, and it's often sometimes like somewhat that, but it's often, much of it is not that.
Makes me think of Schrodinger's cat, or these typical experiments of, quantum physics with the light going through the disks that make these kind of patterns and stuff. Like, again, it could go back to that idea of from where we are assessing it, and this whole kind of scaffolding that we've built towards measuring and assessing, that there is this kind of regularity, which gets at another thing, which is not that you're just changing the environment, right? For example, let's talk about regeneration, just because I know we have to go soon. I wanted to at least bring up that word, but you're not changing the environment when you regenerate, are you? Is it just that simple that you're changing the electrical pattern, and we could just call that the computational surface, or we could call that the light cone, that you've somehow now changed the pattern of the encounter, and therefore the agent itself will change? Or it's not that simple, is it?
No. And these words are not interchangeable. So like the cognitive, we don't know how to change the cognitive light cone. The cognitive light cone is the scale of the biggest goals that a particular system can pursue. Actually, that's not quite true. I think in the cancer treatments, we do expand the cognitive light cone, but that's not what we do for regeneration. So in regeneration, we try to we change the environment in two ways. One is like for example, for limb regeneration, we have this wearable bioreactor. And part of that, and it gives us like protective aqueous environment. Part of that is to convince the cells that it's safe and it's worthwhile to put energy into regenerating. If you're a mouse or something and you're running around outside and your arm gets bitten off, you're not gonna be able to regenerate anything because you're putting weight on it, you're getting infected and stuff like that. So the cells, there's no point in trying to regenerate anything. So you're trying to convince the cells that it's a safe environment. Also, you're providing a payload of drugs that target the electric state of the cells, that convince them that the journey through morphospace that they should take is the one that goes towards making a limb and not the one that goes to scarring and stopping growth. There are multiple paths that they could take. So you're trying to point
happening at once. You are actually changing the chemical kind of the ion channels via chemicals too, not just
you have to, but if you get, but the problem is if you get, and people do say, they say, oh, you're talking all this stuff about these high level controls, but I see you're just putting chemicals on ion channels. If you focus on that part, it's like when you're showing your thermostat to somebody who's never used one, they're sort of staring at how your finger goes on the button. They go, oh, I see. It's the physical interaction between your skin and the button of the thermostat. And you say, yes, okay, that occurs, but you're missing the whole point. Like, that isn't the important part. They're saying, no, I'm tracking the physics. That's what you've done. You've put your skin on the button. Like, yeah, I guess, but you're missing what's important about this. And I think it's the same thing here. We use these chemicals to get the channels to open and close, but that isn't the point. The point is that the reason we did it is to control the decision-making of the collective intelligence. And that's the hard part. The hard part is figuring out what signals are going to convince that group of cells to do A versus B. And
that's happening at a different level.
Yeah, that's at a completely different level. And that means that you really have to have a model of the internal perspective of the system. With a bowling ball, You don't have to do much of that. It's just you look at the landscape and you kind of know what's going to happen. With a living system or various other complex systems that have to be alive, you really have to pay a lot of attention to what are the internal beliefs, the goals, the competencies, the memories of the system. Otherwise, you have no idea what your signals should be.
Okay. So how is it different? Something like, how is this different from something like talk therapy or something? Like, what would be different, right? When we do talk therapy, we are kind of literally, of course, people get really mystical about, the vibration, and we're changing the vibration. And you do literally, when you meditate or something, or when you talk, you change the vibration. Is that, like, people might say, oh, that's changing the bioelectricity field too. And,
I mean, it
how is this
is
different?
in a certain sense. If somebody talks you into taking up an exercise program because they sort of point out how good it is for you and all that, they've absolutely changed the bioelectrical properties of your
Yep.
cells because you're going to flex your muscles and all this kind of stuff. I mean, so on the one hand, yes. And one of my favorite quotes is Fabrizio Benedetti, who says, words and drugs have the same mechanism of action. And I think that's true. In the end, that's absolutely true. But like with everything else, it's an empirical question. What is the best level? Is the best level? So here's my claim, and it is an experimental claim, and I could be proven wrong, and we will see. Here's my claim: the best way to do regeneration is not at the low level of managing molecules, and it is not at the high level of talk therapy. It is in the middle of addressing the bioelectric memories of collectives of cells. Now, somebody else could say, "Guess what, dude? You missed the most exciting discovery. The most exciting discovery is that I can talk people into regrowing their limbs. Fantastic. I'm not saying that can never happen. Maybe there's a way to go from that high level of verbal interface to the. I mean, there is this field of hypnodermatology where people can make changes in your skin cells by going through the verbal. Maybe at some point somebody will figure out a way to do that for healing and regeneration. Fabulous. At this point, I think the right level is kind of in the middle. It's tweaking directly the memories of the cells. But
Yeah, and
I'm
that's not
open to the.
necessarily, again, that it's not that you're saying that one or the other of those has to be true. It could be all those ways could be ways of changing,
They could, but some
but
of
the
those
most
ways.
efficient would probably be what you
That's
described.
it. Some of those ways will be more effective than others. Yeah, and there are many people. I mean, look, in alternative medicine, right? There are many people who say we will cure your cancer through positive attitude and through meditation. Am I saying that can't happen? No, it can happen. Am I saying it's kind of an effective thing you can count on? Not at the moment.
Right,
So
because there's so
we,
many variables of
we don't know how to
each
do it.
agent would not start at the same place in terms of
And yeah, and so at some point we will find out which is the best, most reliable way to do it.
Last question. I think a lot about transportation because, of course, like for me, the way that we move through the world and these companions, this technology that we build changes our ability to way make, which for me is our ability to navigate our cognitive light cones or capacity changes through that movement. And so sometimes when I'm reading your work, I think about regeneration from this perspective. For example, like electric motorcycles, when you're going downhill, you're regenerating, right? You're actually like refilling your battery just by nothing, by just letting the machine, the vehicle go with the inertia. So this word inertia, I wonder like if you've thought about that or if you can see any
Yeah,
kind of way in which that's also kind of what we do or you
yeah,
might be doing when you're
yeah.
changing the pattern.
I think absolutely. If you think about it as in the simplest way of resistance to change and resistance to stimuli, yeah, every system. If you have no inertia, you're not going to live very long as a complex system because every input is going to destabilize you into some other region. If you're going to be a coherent thing, you have to have inertia in all these different spaces to have some degree of stability. If you have too much inertia, then also you're not going to be. So there's some kind of a sweet spot in different systems for how much resistance you're going to put up to various external changes.
Are you trying to change the inertia in a sense when you're trying to
Yeah, I mean, so one way to think about that, for example, would be, yeah, yes, there are ways to if you have a model, and we haven't published any of this yet, but if you have a model of cellular decision making that includes components of what things do they ignore and what things do they pay attention to, the inertia is by virtue of ignoring a whole bunch of inputs. And so one way to change that, to lower that inertia, might be to help cells to change their mode of attention so that they're now paying attention to other inputs. So yeah, that's potentially, we haven't done that in any existing papers, but that's certainly something that we're working
on. And that would change the competencies too, right?
It might reveal novel competencies, right?
Yeah,
so you might be super competent doing XYZ, but if you're not paying attention to the trigger, then we're as observers, we're not going to see it.
So patterns in inertia are not dissimilar. Inertia is a kind of a electrical pattern in a sense, or could be thought of in that way.
It could. I think of it more as the degree of willingness to reconsider your pattern.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's great. That gets to a whole other thing about awareness. We don't have time now, but awareness and how attention and awareness change.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let you.
Cool.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Great to see you again. Thanks for the conversation.